They show us the Kremlin as a symbol of eternal Rus, but half of its history simply doesn't align with dates, materials, or common sense. What lies before us isn't a fortress, but an archive of crimes. The Kremlin here functions as a piece of evidence, and the more closely you examine its walls, the less of the schoolbook version remains. For years we've been told, Moscow is made of white stone, and the Kremlin grew from a luminous, almost fairy tale-like rock. But lift your eyes to the Spasskaya Tower, and suddenly there's a foreign sign in Latin letters with Roman ears. This isn't just a detail, it's an embedded enigma. They say the Kremlin is built from light-colored stone meant to shine in the sun. But where are those stones now? Do they still exist? Or is that just a legend masking something else? On the Spasskaya Tower, the main tower of the Kremlin, hangs a plaque reminiscent of Roman inscriptions with characteristic ears on the sides. This isn't mere decoration. This symbol stands out sharply against the context of Russian architecture and history. Why does the main tower of Russia's fortress bear a plaque in Roman style? What message is hidden in these Latin letters and shapes? An ordinary date? Or an alien signature beneath the Kremlin's history? Could it be that Moscow was once under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire? These questions cast doubt on the familiar narrative. Comparing this plaque with Roman reliefs and engravings reveals an astonishing similarity. It's no coincidence, no fashion statement. It's a sign demanding decoding and a reconsideration of what we know about Moscow's and the Kremlin's origins. So why does the official story insist that the Kremlin was built from white stone, a symbol of purity and strength? Why don't we see these white stone walls today? The Kremlin has survived the Mongol-Tatar yoke, Napoleonic invasions, perestroika, and massive 20th century constructions, all of which could have erased traces, but not entirely destroyed the material that should have been the fortress's foundation. Mongol-Tatar rule, the destruction wrought by Napoleon, the reforms and rebuilds, these sound like a set of reasons for the disappearance of white stone Moscow. But doesn't that seem too convenient? Too many foreign mechanisms and temporary cataclysms, as if deliberately erasing memory and material evidence. Could these events be perceived as repairs of an alien epoch, where, under the guise of restoration, traces of previous eras and cultures are wiped out? This isn't just reconstruction. It's an attempt to rewrite history, making it convenient for those who control the narrative. And here's the main enigma. If Moscow was truly built of white stone, where are these stones now? Why does the Spasskaya Tower, a symbol of Russian statehood, display a plaque with a Latin inscription resembling Roman standards? What does this plaque hide? Just a date? Or a sign of foreign influence and control? The question is simple but uncomfortable. Perhaps the history of Moscow and the Kremlin is more complex and tangled than we've been told. Maybe white stone Moscow isn't just a legend, but part of a larger puzzle, where every element, even the most unexpected, matters. If the official narrative creaks at the seams of facts, then the time has come to ask new questions and seek answers where they are least expected. On paper, everything looks beautiful. During Ivan Kalida's reign, the first stone temples appear, and Moscow takes a step toward its white stone fame. But if you look closer at the current cathedrals, the old descriptions crumble like plaster along the seams. What we face is not a single ancient picture, but a multi-layered collage. Indeed, during Ivan Kalida's era, the first stone churches emerge on the cathedral square. The Dormition and Archangel cathedrals, along with an early stone church replacing wooden structures. Historians call this the beginning of white stone Moscow. Yet, digging deeper, it turns out that the first Archangel Cathedral, mentioned in Chronicles, bears no relation to what stands today. The modern church is a later construction, built in a different style with other architectural solutions. The original Dormition Cathedral was entirely different. It was a single-dome church with kokoshniks, decorative elements that were later added to and rebuilt. Over time, new chapels were attached, and the structure expanded, transforming into the complex we see now. But at its core, it was based on a different architectural concept than the current one. This was not merely a reconstruction, it was a transformation, erasing traces of the original appearance. Interestingly, the prototype for the Dormition Cathedral might have been the Georgievsky Cathedral in Yuriev Polski. That church has preserved a single dome structure with kokoshniks, close in style and proportions to descriptions of the ancient Dormition. This suggests that Moscow's early stone constructions were closer to provincial models rather than the monumental complexes we are accustomed to seeing today. Besides these cathedrals, there were other early stone buildings on the cathedral square. Their number was small and documentation is scarce, but the fact remains. The stone architecture of Moscow at that time was modest and lacked the monumentality associated with the Kremlin today. This is not just a reconstruction, but a multi-layered collage, where each layer is a new version of history superimposed on the previous one. And here lies the main question. How honest are our reconstructions? If the first Archangel Cathedral is not what we see now, if the Dormition has changed beyond recognition, how many times can the cathedral complex be reshaped without leaving old traces? Why do we not find authentic remains of these first stone churches? Why does official history so easily separate the early stone Kremlin from what exists today, as if they are different cities? It seems that historians and restorers work with a version resembling an illustration of the idea of white stone Moscow, rather than a result of thorough analysis of real remains. This quiet inconsistency is not immediately obvious, but becomes clear upon close examination of the architecture and documents. What we see is not an ancient unified picture, but a complex puzzle of different eras and styles layered over each other. This is not merely reconstruction, but a continuous rewriting of history in stone. If that's the case, then what exactly do we call the first stone Kremlin? Is it a real object or an idealized image, created retroactively? The questions remain open, and the answers are far from obvious. We are shown films where a palisade is an impregnable fortress, and warriors clash against logs until the last breath. But in real Moscow, any oak fence would turn into a torch at the first serious fire. This is not defense but decoration for the gullible. Moscow burned regularly. Nearly every Friday, chronicles record massive fires sweeping entire neighborhoods. Under such conditions, wooden walls, no matter how sturdy the oak, became flammable traps. An oak palisade with sharp stakes and projecting battlements was not a fortress, but a barrier against forest beasts. The palisade itself, a dense row of vertically driven logs, sometimes with superstructures called spiced-up fortifications, seems designed for defense. One would think that battlements and superstructures should enhance protection, but in reality, they only increase the surface area of combustible material. When fire engulfed the city, these spices turned into wicks, rapidly spreading flames along the entire wall. The fire destroyed not only houses, but also the fortress itself. Oak walls burned as easily as firewood in a hearth. This was not just a weak point, it was a fundamental flaw in the logic of defense. If the wall burns, it cannot hold back the enemy. So why build such a fortress? To impress guests, or to make the inhabitants feel safe? The answer is obvious. It was more a decoration than real protection. The image of an impregnable wooden stronghold is a romantic myth that cannot withstand scrutiny. It's easier to set fire to a wall than to storm it. Any warrior, even without siege equipment, could turn a palisade into a blazing torch, transforming the defense into a deadly trap for those behind it. How could anyone seriously consider such a barrier reliable? This question demands an answer. If the palisade is a barrier against beasts, whom could it truly stop? An enemy with a sword and bow, or a forest boar? Clearly, such a fence could not withstand serious confrontation. It was not designed to repel sieges or large-scale attacks. But why, then, do chronicles describe this fortification calmly without noting its vulnerability? Why does no one question its effectiveness? Especially strange is Ivan Kalita's decision to build walls from oak, knowing how often Moscow burned. The chronicles do not hide the fire statistics. they were regular and destructive. Knowing this, why choose wood over stone? Perhaps the answer lies not in defensive logic, but in accessibility and speed of construction. But if so, why are we still being led to believe that it was a fortress capable of protecting the city? In the end, what we see is not a fortress, but an exposed decoration, serving more to intimidate and symbolically demarcate than for real defense. It's not a wall that could stop an enemy, but a wooden palisade that would burn like a torch at the first serious fire. Why build such a defense in a city that burns almost weekly? And why do chronicles not question this obvious absurdity? Taking all this into account, Dmitry Donskoy's decision to move the Kremlin to the white stone suddenly appears not just logical, but the only reasonable choice. White stone is no longer mere decoration. It becomes genuine protection. More on this in the next chapter. The chronicler confidently writes, "In the same winter, Moscow rises from the ashes already in stone. But when you start to calculate the height, length, and thickness of the Kremlin's walls, that phrase turns into a challenge. Not only do the numbers not add up, but common sense also seems to be at odds. The chronicle date, 1367, or summer of 6875 by Old Russian reckoning, records the moment when the stone Kremlin is supposedly rebuilt. And not gradually, but precisely in the same winter, immediately after the fire and siege. The wording sounds like a dare. The wooden walls burn down, and in that very winter, a fortress of white stone rises in their place. But what does "in the same winter" mean in the context of medieval Russia? Several months of cold, snow, and short daylight, during which not only must the foundation be laid, but the walls, comparable in size to the modern Kremlin, must be built. The scale is staggering. The fortress expands beyond the old wooden fortifications almost to the current lines. The length of the walls is several hundred meters. The height and thickness are comparable to today's. Modern Kremlin walls reach 5 to 19 meters in height, with a base thickness of up to 6 meters. There are about 20 towers and more than 10 gates. These are not just figures. They represent an enormous volume of stonework that had to be quarried, processed, transported, and laid. Let's estimate the labor involved. Thousands of cubic meters of stone. Each piece had to be extracted, shaped, transported, and lifted to height. Even with modern technology, such construction would take more than one season. And what about the 14th century, when there were no cranes or powerful transport? Can you imagine hundreds of stonemasons and carpenters preparing raw materials and building walls that would stand for centuries, all in one winter? Here begins an arithmetic rebellion. How much stone would need to be mined? Where did the thousands of cubic meters of white stone come from? How was logistics organized in medieval Moscow? The Moscow River froze in winter, making heavy cargo transport more difficult. Summer was too short for such large-scale work. Could the chronicler simply be exaggerating? Or is this a legend, an explanation for the city's miraculous rebirth? The question is simple but uncomfortable. Was it really possible to erect such walls in a single season, even with modern machinery? The answer is obvious: no. So why does the chronicler confidently speak of the same winter? Is this a real story, or a religious legend about a miraculous stone city, born by divine will and human resolve, but outside the bounds of logic and time? If we accept the chronicle data at face value, we face a paradox. The scale of the construction and the timeline do not match any known technology or logistics. It's not just a discrepancy of numbers, it's a challenge to common sense. So what really happened in 1367? Were these walls built then? Or is this a later attribution designed to give Moscow a legendary status? To cover up the gaps in history and craft a myth of sudden revival? Until we find the answer, the story of the stone Kremlin remains suspended between reality and myth. Perhaps that is the key to understanding not only the architecture, but also the very history of Moscow itself. The white stone Dimitrov Kremlin barely has time to settle into memory before it begins to be dismantled for its stones. In its place, a brick fortress rises, and the chronicles fall silent on where that white mass disappeared to. It seems as if some walls were built only so others could be carefully erased. Under Ivan III, the white stone Kremlin quickly loses its face. Walls and towers are dismantled, stone is removed, and new fortifications of fired brick are erected in their stead. This transition is not merely a technical or aesthetic choice, it symbolizes a new era and a different approach to fortress construction. Why is such a durable and prestigious white stone Kremlin so easily dismantled? Stone is not wood, it cannot be broken or burned so easily. What is the logic behind demolishing the standing walls and rebuilding anew? Interestingly, the Assumption Cathedral, built in the same period, preserves fidelity to white stone. Master Fioravante from Italy constructs the cathedral precisely from white stone, becoming a symbol of spiritual and architectural continuity. This contrast, the brick walls of the Kremlin and the white stone cathedral, carries an important message. Why choose a new material for the fortress walls, yet retain the old for the main church? Perhaps the cathedral was meant to preserve the memory of the previous era, while the fortress was to emphasize the new order. The layers of time within the Assumption Cathedral also raise questions. Its consecration occurs before the construction is complete. Dionysius's frescoes appear years later. Ivan IV's coronation takes place in an unfinished building. The cathedral is not just a building, but a symbolic object, living its own life, separate from the course of Kremlin construction. It serves as an anchor of memory amid rapid change. Returning to the fortress walls, the great construction under Ivan III is not merely repairs or reinforcement. The Kremlin is being rebuilt almost entirely, layer by layer. And then, the strangest moment. Historical sources remain silent on where all the white stone from the walls and towers went. Thousands of blocks, which should have been stored or reused somewhere, simply vanish from chronicles. This is no accident. This silence is part of a conscious erasure of traces of the past. Can this be considered a simple reconstruction, or an attempt to erase the memory of the former Kremlin, to pretend it never existed? Why does history so often offer us a new Kremlin, rather than an honest account of what came before? Is it not too easy to accept this epoch change when in reality something deeper is happening? Destruction of a layer of history that could tell us much. The questions remain open. Why was the stone Kremlin, built with such effort and significance, dismantled so quickly and without a trace? Where are the traces of thousands of white stone blocks? Why does history prefer a new version instead of preserving the old? It seems as if this eternal construction is not merely an architectural process. It is a tool used to erase the past, to make it disappear unnoticed. Within this silence, in the vanishing of the white stone, lies a disturbing sign. The memory of the former Kremlin is deliberately cleansed to make room for a new, more convenient version of history. On Cathedral Square, everything seems whole and harmonious, as if it were a single ensemble of original Rus. But behind this harmony hides a vanished cathedral and necropolis, quietly relocated without witnesses. Here, not only stone was changed, bones were moved as well. Where the old Archangel Cathedral once stood, now rises a new structure, monumental and ruthless in its modernity. According to accounts, the old building withered and was demolished, leaving almost no traces behind. No foundation, no stone, no hint that ancestors once rested here. How did it happen that such a significant church disappeared without a trace? Is it possible to erase an entire architectural layer, as if it were merely an inconvenient obstacle? The same applies to the Assumption and Annunciation cathedrals. They were not simply restored, they were replaced with new, more imposing structures to emphasize the grandeur of royal power. But what happened to those buried within the old temples? Russian czars and princes, whose tombs occupied central places, were forced to relocate to new walls. How exactly? Where were the remains stored during these reconstructions? Chronicles remain silent. Not a word about relocations, rituals, or temporary burials. This silence is not just a gap in documents, it is a deliberate erasure of traces. Everything old was cleaned out, wiped from the face of the earth to make way for something new, shining, and flawless. But can bones be so easily relocated? What remains of memory if the ashes of ancestors become a burden that must be quietly removed? With each cycle of reconstruction, we see an ever later layer of architecture that obscures and absorbs the previous ones. Early levels fade into shadow, as if they never existed. This is not merely a stylistic change, it's a rewriting of history, where each new stone attempts to rewrite the past, erasing its human and cultural context. The key question: how to move an entire dynasty from one temple to another without leaving almost any traces in the texts? Why did the royal necropolis survive a complete rebuild without clear documentary records? Could it be that the lives and deaths of rulers mattered less than the aesthetics of new architecture for tourists and official ceremonies? This is not just about architectural modifications. It is a grim sense of human erasure, when, along with the stone, personalities and memories vanish. Cathedral Square is not only an ensemble of original roofs, but also a place where history was rewritten, not only by architects' hands, but also through the silence of chroniclers. The explosion of the Kremlin during Napoleon's retreat could have been a dream for any ruin hunter artist. But instead of dozens of dramatic views with collapsed walls, we see only a few neat pictures and a quiet, well, they blew something up. It feels as if the ruins themselves were cleaned up. During the retreat, Napoleon indeed ordered the Kremlin to be blown up, an event that should have left behind spectacular destruction. It seems like the perfect story: massive explosions, collapsing walls, dust, and ruins. But what do we actually see? Almost nothing. The ruins in Moscow existed. Even the Nikolskaya Tower was damaged, yet it became almost the sole visual testament to the explosion. Why, then, do artists, who usually seize every opportunity to depict the drama of destruction, appear to have lost interest here? Where are the dozens of paintings with collapsing Kremlin walls? Why are there almost no landscape views showing the scale of the devastation? The answer is not so simple. Perhaps it's not a lack of material, but that the footage was carefully edited, like someone decided that not all ruins should enter the visual memory. Looking at images of the Nikolskaya gates and towers from different eras reveals a strange inconsistency. In some paintings, the tower is damaged. In others, it's nearly intact. In yet others, it's restored to such a degree that it's hard to believe it suffered recent destruction. This inconsistency prompts a question. Is the absence of authentic views of the ruined Kremlin an attempt to hide an uncomfortable truth? The brick Kremlin itself, despite its massive presence and historical significance, is almost never depicted with broken walls. We do not see the craters and breaches that should have remained after a powerful explosion. If the blast was truly as massive as described, why do visual records appear sparse and tidy? Perhaps this is more than just a loss of artistic interest. The scene shifts to the Chinese Wall, another element that might shed light on the situation. Cuts and diagrams of this fortification from rare sources allow us to glimpse its defensive structure of that time. Yet even these materials show no signs of the large-scale destruction that would confirm the Kremlin explosion. Another hint that the visual memory of the event was meticulously cleaned up. Why, after such a loud explosion, are there almost no paintings or engravings depicting the ruins of the Kremlin? Where did the artist's passion for ruins go when the shattered center of Moscow was at hand? Doesn't it seem that the absence of ruins is not accidental, but a deliberate concealment or editing of the visual history? If the destruction was as described, shouldn't more evidence have survived? Or are we dealing with a carefully curated version of the past, where even war and fortress explosions appear too neat and orderly? Ultimately, it feels as though the most dramatic events in the Kremlin's history, the explosion and destruction, have been meticulously retouched in the collective visual memory. There are too few traces, too little chaos, too little truth that should have been obvious. If that's the case, what does this silence and sterility of images conceal? Perhaps we will never see the real ruins of the brick Kremlin because they simply do not exist where we expect to find them. The familiar gaze glides past the stars and clocks of the Spasskaya Tower, oblivious to the stone insert beneath them. But once you read the Latin inscription, suddenly the Kremlin wall begins to speak in a foreign tongue. It's not just graffiti, it's a passport issued to someone for our fortress. The triangular ears on the sides of the plaque are no random decoration. They are a classic element of Roman epigraphy, found on monuments from antiquity and medieval Europe. Such a form is uncharacteristic of Russian architectural traditions of that era, which favored simpler or ornamental frames. Why was this Western style chosen for the main tower of the Kremlin? The answer cannot be accidental. The inscription itself is a Latin epitaph listing the titles of the Grand Prince and his possessions. The name Ivan III appears there, but in a context that extends beyond the usual understanding of Moscow's authority. The enumeration of lands resembles European formulas of legitimation, where titles and possessions are not mere words but legal declarations. The date, 1491, is a key moment. It was then that the brick Kremlin was built, symbolizing a new era and the ambitions of the Moscow state. Comparing it to Roman and European examples shows this is not just decoration. Such inscriptions served as signs of official recognition, a kind of passport for the object, confirming its status and belonging within an international context. Engravings and reliefs from that era feature similar texts, sealing treaties, rights, and sovereignty. So, what then makes such an element appear on the main tower of the Kremlin? The question is simple, but uncomfortable. Why put a plaque not in Church Slavonic, but in Latin on a key Russian fortress? For whom is it meant? For the internal population, barely able to read these lines? Or for external recipients, European monarchs and diplomatic circles? If it's an appeal to the West, what does it say about Moscow's status at the end of the 15th century? Moreover, does this plaque not merely serve as a heraldic symbol, but resemble a contractual tag? An official stamp confirming Moscow's participation in a broad political configuration, where the Moscow ruler is just one player. Whose signature truly adorns the Kremlin? Only that of the Grand Prince of Moscow? Or someone else with influence and weight at the time? This element on the main tower is not just a mark of power, but a sign of authority with a foreign handwriting. It prompts reflection. How autonomous was Moscow's sovereignty, and how much was it embedded within the European system of relations? And if so, how does our understanding of history change when we see the most prominent part of the Kremlin adorned with a Latin plaque in Roman style, bearing titles beyond the usual scope? Ultimately, this stone insert is not merely an architectural relic. It is a challenge to conventional ideas about who and how signed the Moscow Kremlin. The question remains open. Whose signature is on the main tower of the Russian fortress? Who truly held the pen when this inscription was created? In textbooks, the Italians helping with architecture are seen as charming Italians assisting with the design. But if you look closer, the Kremlin begins to appear as an object assembled according to someone else's blueprint. There is far too much European influence embedded in what is presented as a purely Russian fortress. They called them Friazi, foreigners, mostly Italians, who arrived in Moscow alongside Ivan III. It was they who designed and built the walls and towers of the Kremlin, and their names are preserved in chronicles and documents. But why was this particular group entrusted with the key fortress of the Russian state? Why not local craftsmen who knew the terrain and traditions better? This is no trivial question. During Ivan III's era, Moscow was only beginning to transform into the center of a great power, and the construction of the Kremlin became a symbol of new authority. Yet many crucial architectural decisions belonged to the newcomers. For instance, on the Spasskaya Tower, a Latin inscription can still be seen, not a Russian sign, but a European one, clearly indicating a connection to the West. Why Latin? Who was it meant to impress? Moscow or European courts? Looking at the broader picture, it becomes evident that the Kremlin is not merely a Russian fortress. The architectural language in which it was built increasingly resembles a European code. This is not just a style or fashion, it is a system of symbols serving as a political message. The connection to ideas from the Holy Roman Empire is perhaps no coincidence. Moscow might have been viewed as a protectorate or branch of a broader imperial structure. In this context, the Kremlin is not only a defensive structure, but also an architectural manifesto embedded in European political play. Meanwhile, our craftsmen often remained in the shadows. They were entrusted with secondary tasks, while key projects were assigned to foreigners. This is not simply a matter of professional skill, it's about control and influence. Who truly dictated the tone of construction and shaped the image of the Kremlin? Why did the outsiders gain the right to craft a symbol of authority meant to inspire fear and respect within the country? In the end, the Kremlin appears as an object assembled by foreign hands and logic. It is not just a fortress, it is a complex political project, woven into the European system of coordinates. Why do we still perceive it solely as a symbol of Russian sovereignty? Doesn't this entire story resemble the construction of a branch of an imperial project under a local guise? The questions remain. Why was the key fortress of the Russian state so actively entrusted to foreigners? Whom is this architectural language truly meant to impress? Moscow or Europe? Should we not view the Kremlin as part of external political architecture, where symbolism and style serve not only internal purposes, but also international games? This cold realization changes many things. What once seemed our own turns out to be built according to someone else's blueprint. This is the key to understanding not only the Kremlin, but also how Russian statehood was formed in its earliest and most significant manifestations. When we combine the wooden fortresses, the stone marvels, the vanished white stone, and the Latin inscriptions on Russian towers, the Kremlin ceases to be just a fortress. Before us stands a structure, a complex political and cultural construct, a symbol woven into a European narrative of power and influence. A mosaic assembled from countless strange coincidences. Such a sum of anomalies in itself is a proof. Let's start with the oak walls that supposedly surrounded Moscow in flames. Imagine, the city is burning, and around it, solid oak structures meant to shield it from the fire. But by the early 15th century, these wooden walls give way to white stone constructions, erected literally overnight. How is that even possible? Stone walls built in the harsh conditions of the Russian winter, almost a miracle. But if it's a miracle, why did the white stone Kremlin last only a couple of centuries before undergoing a total reconstruction? Rebuilding is a story of its own. The white stone is dismantled, bricks are laid anew, new cathedrals and bell towers appear, which do not just alter the appearance, but erase the memory of previous eras. Why does each major layer of Kremlin history end with almost complete destruction of what came before? Demolition, dismantling, replacement. Almost as if someone consciously seeks to erase traces of the past, rewriting history stone by stone. And this is not a one-off event, but a series of systemic actions repeated with enviable regularity. Even more puzzling is the disappearance of vast amounts of material. The white stone, weighing thousands of tons, simply vanishes. Not a single report on how or where it was transported. Not a word about the logistics of this massive operation. Burials beneath the foundations also mysteriously disappear, or are moved without a trace. Why do the sources remain silent? Are there too many forgotten details surrounding a single fortress? If it's just coincidence, why do stone, burials, and memory all vanish simultaneously? The explosion orchestrated by Napoleon in 1812 is yet another question. According to the official version, the Kremlin was subjected to a powerful blast that should have left ruins and chaos. But there are almost no visual signs of destruction. Where are the ruins that would be obvious after such an event? If the explosion was so powerful, why was the Kremlin quickly restored? And why do the traces of destruction look so neatly fitted to the official narrative? Special attention is drawn to the Latin plaque on one of the towers and the involvement of European architects in the Kremlin's construction. These are not just details. They are markers of external influence that do not fit the traditional image of the Russian Kremlin as a purely national symbol. Why Latin inscriptions on the towers? Why European craftsmen? Could it mean that the Kremlin is not only a product of Russian history, but also intertwined with European history, rewritten and reshaped to serve specific political agendas? Ultimately, it creates the impression that the official narrative is not a straightforward account of historical objects, but a carefully crafted scenario. A scenario that conceals more than it reveals, fitting facts into a convenient version rather than the other way around. Are there not too many coincidences and forgotten details surrounding the same place? Why does each major layer of Kremlin history end with almost complete erasure of what came before? And most importantly, can all of this be just coincidence? Or are we dealing with a conscious policy of rewriting memory? There are no definitive answers yet, but the very sum of these anomalies gives us reason to pause. The worldview is cracking at the seams, and the Kremlin is no longer just a fortress. It's much more complex. It's a story someone has tried to rewrite, conceal, and replace. In this intertwining of facts and mysteries, we see not merely an architectural structure, but a symbol of how history can be artificially crafted and rewritten. The Kremlin can be perceived as a postcard or as tangible proof of Moscow's rewritten history. Its walls, towers, and plaques do not shout, but they hold layer after layer of чужих решений, foreign decisions. The question is one: are we ready to read these walls as a text? The history of the Kremlin is not just a sequence of events, but a chain of erasures, reconstructions, and чужих отметок, foreign marks. Every stone here is a witness not just to an era, but to the intentions of those who rewrote the past. We are used to seeing the Kremlin as a symbol of power and celebration, but what if it is primarily a tangible evidence? Not a decoration for parades, but an archive hiding far more than official chronicles reveal. Look at the walls and towers not as mere adornments, but as evidence. Plaques, engravings, plans. These are not just details, but clues demanding careful reading. They do not reveal secrets immediately, but if you look closer, it becomes clear. They record чужие решения, foreign decisions, and perspectives on the city. The Kremlin is not only a fortress, but also a repository of multiple layers of history that no one wanted to show. Will we be able to perceive the Kremlin simply as a beautiful backdrop for celebrations after this? Or is it time to admit that the main fortress of the country is also its chief archive of hidden history? This question does not require an answer now, but it must stay with us. If we learn to read these walls, we will see that they encode not only dates and names, but also plots that official sources sidestep. And this is just the beginning. Ahead lie the Nikolskaya Tower, Kitai-Gorod, other fortress lines and cathedrals, each with its own mysteries and testimonies. We are not just studying architecture, we are analyzing it as a complex text where every detail matters. This is an invitation not to passive perception, but to active analysis, to stop accepting everything at face value and to start seeing the city as a living archive. You are not wasting your time when you learn to see Moscow as a book, its pages covered with dust of oblivion and deliberate forgetfulness. This is not just a walk, but an immersion into a multi-layered history where every stone can tell more than it seems. And even if we do not yet know everything, we already see enough to stop taking things at face value. Are we ready to accept that the Kremlin is not just a symbol, but the main witness of rewritten history? That behind facades and towers lies a layer of information waiting to be read properly? The question is simple, but the answer changes everything. We stand on the threshold of understanding that will overturn our usual notions of the city and its past. That is why the investigation does not end here. This is the first installment in a series of analyses designed to reveal Moscow not merely as a collection of beautiful vistas, but as a complex, multifaceted archive. The Kremlin is not just a monument, it's a challenge to those willing to look deeper. If we accept this challenge, we'll see that the city's history isn't just a string of dates and names, but a living, evolving text, one that can be read anew and reinterpreted. The Kremlin hasn't become clearer, it's become more honest. Now you see the seams, the substitutions, and the truths that are often left unspoken on guided tours. These questions should resonate louder than official fairy tales. Subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you won't miss new investigations. Many mysteries and discoveries await us ahead. We will continue to seek clues, ask uncomfortable questions, and explore what official history tends to overlook. Because the truth is always nearby, it just takes the will to see it.